Hello, welcome back to another video on why comic books are so addictive. It's been a while, a few weeks since I done a video for this series. One of the things that fascinate me over the many years as a collector is the different generation gap of the collectors, and sometimes that can be not 20 or 30 years. You're talking about even in a span of about 10 years there is a huge gap between the taste and preferences of collectors that are 10 years apart. A perfect example of that is Rob Liefeld, perhaps one of a more polarized, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but for the sake of this video, it's definitely one of those polarized names that whenever you mention today, in the previous many years, you have a fairly big contrast reaction of the fan. You either love him or you hate him, right? Very few comic book artists brought out that kind of reaction between the fan. No doubt he has a huge fandom that love him, as well as a large amount of people that do not like him. And it's funny because whenever, most of the time, whenever I hear his name brought up and debates about him, occasionally you will hear some people get very defensive that why are you hating on him so much? I grew up with him, I love him, all that stuff. And this is where the topic of this video comes in, because Rob Liefeld is younger than me. So when he broke into the industry, I was in college, and no doubt, he has talent. No doubt, big kudos for him to make it into Marvel at such a young age. And at the time when I saw his art, I was in college. I can't say that I don't hate it. I can also say that I did not like it. And the criticisms that he draw funny ankles, feet, and pouches and pockets and all that stuff, that's fine. But as far as drawing things that are not proportioned and all that stuff, that really doesn't bother me that much, because by this point of my collecting cycle, I am more into the Walt Simonson, Frank Miller, and Bill Sienkiewicz. So those type of artists are not in the same style as somebody like John Byrne or Neil Adams. They do, their style are somewhat, it's hard to put a label on those three artists, but they are definitely not in the same realism style as Neil Adams, with the right proportion, muscle, and all that stuff. So somewhat abstract. So because I love those names, those artists, that the way Rob Liefeld drew, it didn't bother me. It bothered me more on the way he used the layout, the oversized panel, and all that stuff. He's in his early day. He's already pretty unique in the way that he laid out the panel. thankfully I will not be doing a artist spotlight on Rob Liefeld because I gave away most of his books that I have, so I can't really show you what I'm talking about. But the funny thing is, it's different to be a 20-year-old person, me back then, looking at Rob Liefeld work and feel indifferent. I collected the X-Force more because I was a big fan of the mutants, and that's fall into my completeness of collecting all the mutants title. Um, you know, but the 20-year-old in me is not the same as a 10-year-old at the same time. I can see the fan base, the hype, the mania around Liefeld was not. I don't believe that it was in my age group. You know, it was more for the younger crowd. Correct me if I'm wrong. For those that remember what it was like to buy comic books off the rack when Rob Liefeld started to hit the market. How old were you, and what do you think about his style? All I can say is, the 20-year-old in me didn't care for it. I didn't hate it, but certainly I'm in the camp that you know I didn't love it, didn't care for it, and certainly over the years I become more biased toward hating it, because I was all fine and good that he's fine, I don't care. But then as the hype and mania around Rob Liefeld start to blow up and people gush over his stuff, then no doubt I have my bias, and slowly I dislike his work more and more because it just didn't sit well in my stomach that people are gushing over his work. But that's just my personal opinion. These days, I couldn't care less. Love him, hate him, doesn't matter. If people ask me if I like Rob Liefeld, my answer is no. That's it. I don't need to defend my personal opinions about him, but that's it. And it's fascinating for me to go back in time and look at how I feel about other legends that you know um, I was exposed to. One of the funniest thing is, when I first started to collect comic book in 1981, I knew nothing, heard nothing, and have nothing about Jack Kirby, um, and Steve Ditko. I knew nothing about them in 1981. If you watch my video in about my history of collecting, by 1982 I only lived on New Scotland Avenue for a very short 6 months. So by early 1982 we moved. I had to move, so there was a lot of chaos and hectic of moving, relocating. I actually moved to a project, the ghetto, and that's where eventually I met two other friends that went to the same school in the same grade and lived in the same project that I lived in, and that's my first time that I interact with other young collectors. And that's where and when they introduced me to Jack Kirby. Of course they were my age, but they collected probably 5, 6, 7 years before I did, and they were very knowledgeable about the comic world because I learned a lot from listening to them banters about different creators, different characters, different storyline. And they were surprised that I never heard of Jack Kirby. So they encouraged me to take a look at his work, most notably his recent stuff that was on the rack. And I remember going to the LCS with them, and luckily, many of Jack Kirby current stuff at the time was abundance. You know, there was plenty to be had and plenty to be able to buy for cheap. So here is the very first Jack Kirby drawn book that I bought from my LCS. Is Captain Victory #4. If you don't have this series, I highly recommend grabbing them because they are very cheap. I was able to grab issue 4, 3, 2, and 1 for cheap at the store because they have boxes of those stuff, and I'm pretty sure I paid less than cover price for them even back then. One of the things that is great, I remember the very first thing that I noticed right away from these, I definitely enjoy the art. It didn't blow my mind. It you gotta understand, this is 1982, so my mind is still around all about John Byrne and Dave Cockrum and Neil Adams. So the style was okay. I was not wowed by it, but the one thing about this series that jumped out at me was the coloring. And I've been saying this for years, that the coloring scheme of this series is one of a kind. I can't recall seeing another series at the time that have the same coloring scheme. By that I mean, if you have these books and flip through them, there's very little white that was used. All the panels are very beautifully colored, and even the background was in different shade. So it stood out, for me, as far as the uniqueness of it. And that's to be honest, in 1982, that was what I thought was awesome instead of the Kirby art. But let's take a look what I'm talking about. If you go from panels to panels, okay, very little white was used. All the backgrounds are color, and I just thought it was very unique. I thought it was very cool, and of course, I was intrigued, no doubt, by Kirby's style back then. And so my first impression of Kirby was, interesting. But I fully didn't get on the bandwagon yet, at this point of my young collecting career. And at the same time, not that they were talking about Steve Ditko, but during the move and all the hectic, I was not able to go to the LCS as often as I wanted to the first couple of weeks, if not the first 2 or 3 months, as I settled into my new location. So I bought a lot of books on the rack at wherever I can find it. So one of the books that I picked up in 1982 that I did not like at all, it's this right here. Okay, this is Iron Man 160. Okay, it's newsstand because I bought this at a drugstore on my way to school. And I can tell you, the first reaction I had when I opened the first few pages of this book was, wow, who the heck drew this mess? For those that are not familiar with this book, let me know if you can guess it. So let's take a look. Let me see if I can give you a few more pages. Look at that panel. Can you guess who the artist is? Steve Ditko. Okay, so within a very short amount of time, I was exposed to Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, and I can tell you, I did not like this book at all as far as the art. And shortly after that, as my friend discussed about other great artists, they mentioned Steve Ditko, and I remember the huge debate that we had at the time, and as I brought out this book and say, are you kidding me? Steve Ditko is considered great? Have you looked at this book? No doubt, as I get older and get more into, the Silver Age Spider-Man, my opinion of Steve Ditko changed. But, it's funny how the young mind, the way we think, the way we interpret things was very different than the more sophisticated adult that we became. Anyhow, that's it for this video. If you have a funny story of first impression of any artist, I love to hear it, because, outside of people like, the name that I mentioned often, like John Byrne, Neil Adams, Lou Sinkovich, Walt Simonson, very few artists grab me right away. For some reason, it takes time for me to grow into their style, like Frank Miller. No doubt, I was lukewarm on Frank when I saw his work on the Wolverine Limited series. I was lukewarm / indifferent, but then by the time I saw Ronin, mind blown. Okay, anyhow, that's it. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye.